Romans chapter 7. Of course, last week we made it down through verse number 6, and we're going to pick it up here, verse 7. Now, I do want to back up a little bit to read, to grab a little bit of context for the question that is asked in verse 7. And so let's just go back to verse 5. I think verse 5 should be sufficient. He says, "For when we were in the flesh, the motions of sins which were by the law did work in our members to bring forth fruit unto death. But now we are delivered from the law, that being dead, wherein we were held, that we should serve in newness of spirit and not in the oldness of the letter." And so with that context, Paul asks a new question here, verse 7. "What shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid. Nay, I had not known sin, but by the law, for I had not known lust, except the law had said, Thou shalt not covet. But sin, taking occasion by the commandment, wrought in me all manner of concupiscence, for without the law sin was dead. For I was alive without the law once, but when the commandment came, sin revived, and I died. And the commandment which was ordained to life I found to be unto death. For sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and by it slew me. Wherefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy and just and good. Was then that which is good made death unto me? God forbid. But sin, that it might appear sin, working death in me, by that which is good, that sin by the commandment might become exceeding sinful." And so here, Paul, obviously, we mentioned this at the beginning of chapter 7. This whole chapter really is about the Christian's relationship to the law. And questions that Paul would have been receiving as a preacher of this gospel, particularly by Jewish Christians, but by anybody who had knowledge of these fields of study, I guess you could say. And so Paul was responding to questions that he was receiving. One of the biggest questions he would have had was, now that we are, now that we have this freedom, now that we're in grace, what is the relationship of us to the law? And so this is something that Paul is really hitting home here in chapter 7. And so he's continuing to speak of that. And obviously the word law, you're going to hear it a lot this morning, next week as well. And so that's just kind of the nature of the chapter. But he's continued to speak of this topic. And here he returns to this question and answer style that he had begun in chapter 6. And so he's going to ask a question and he's going to answer it. And the question is, again, more than likely, a preemptive a question and response by Paul to answer questions that he's expecting to come from the Roman Christians. Remember, he hasn't been to Rome. He's writing to people he had not yet visited. And so he's answering questions that he's probably received most of the places he's gone. But by this point, Paul has been in ministry long enough. He can kind of anticipate the kind of pushback that he was going to have to the gospel that he's been preaching. And so here he asks this question so that he can provide the answer. You go to a website today, and oftentimes there's a frequently asked questions tab, right? And so that's kind of what Paul is doing here. He's answering the frequently asked questions that he was getting with regards to the gospel he preached. And so this time, Paul is going to give what is a much more personal answer. And I'm not going to get into this next week. We're going to talk about this more next week. But I will say, interestingly enough, that chapter 7, with all the things that Paul says in Romans, chapter 7 is probably one of the most debated chapters in the whole book. With regards to who is Paul talking about. And so starting in verse 7, Paul starts to talk about himself. He says, I did these things. He uses personal pronouns. And so the questions abound as to exactly what Paul, I guess you could say, what time period of Paul's life he's talking about. And so the debate begins here, but then it picks up in earnest really in the next section. So like I said, we'll talk about that more next week. But I just want you to be aware of the fact that there is a lot of debate. I think it's fairly simple. And I think people who are making the debates, they're taking the text and making it more difficult than it needs to be. And I think that happens more often than not. But nevertheless, by answering this question, again, he answers it in an intimate, personal way, but in a way that's relatable. And so we will be able to see ourselves in Paul's answer. And so in so doing, he shows, again, the intricate relationship that exists between Christians and the law, a relationship that ultimately causes us to cling to Christ and the cross. And that's the important part of this. All right. And so that's what we'll get to this morning. And so, like I said, here in verse 7, he asks another question. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? And so the reason he asks this question here is because what I just read to you, verses 5 and 6, really all of chapter 7, but in particular verses 5 and 6 there. So he had just written about how sin had come about as a result of the law. We talked about this a little bit last week. We'll talk about it more today. But sin had come about as a result of the law. The law says don't do this, and it inspired, you could say, a rebelliousness that exists within us. So the law says don't, and we do it. And so there's a sense in which the law was causing things to, or causing sins to have taken place. And then we see there in verse 6 that it was something that we needed to be delivered from, right? And so again, I don't want to rehash all that. We talked about that last week. But if Paul's saying sin has come as a result of the law in and of itself was something that we needed to be delivered from, this could lead people to believe that the law itself was something inherently wicked, that the law itself was an evil thing. Essentially, the question would have been asked of Paul previously in his ministry, and again preemptively now. But the question could have been asked: how could something produce sin that is not in and of itself sinful? Right? And so they're saying, Paul, if you're saying the law produced sin, then you must be saying that the law itself is a sinful thing. And so they're saying, Paul, you are making the claim that the law is a bad thing. It's a negative thing. It's a sinful thing. However, and this is why they would object to this. The law was something given to Israel out of the goodness of God's heart for their prosperity, for their blessing. The law was given to Israel as a means of, if you follow this, not only are you keeping in my will, but it's something that I'm going to use to bestow tremendous blessing and life. There were promises built into the law that if you keep this, you will have a long life. Right? And so the law itself was an expression and an extension of the goodness of God for his people. And so they're saying, how can you claim something that was a good gift of God to be something that is inherently wicked and evil? And so that's the question that Paul is preemptively answering here. And so he asks then, basically this: am I claiming that the law is sin, here in verse 7? And he answers how he answered all the questions in chapter 6 as well. He says, God forbid. God forbid that I would claim something, a good gift from God, is something that is wicked, something that is inherently bad. And he adds to that. He says, nay, I had not known sin, but by the law. For I had not known lust, except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. And so it is not necessarily true. And let me just explain a principle here. It is not necessarily true that something that causes sin is in and of itself sinful. I'll give you another biblical example of this. Paul said, the love of money is the root of all evil. Right? Paul, the love of money is the root of all evil. By the fact that money exists, it has been the root cause of all manner of sin. Just by the fact that money is a tangible thing, it has caused all manner of sin to take place. However, money is an inanimate thing. It cannot, in and of itself, be sinful. Right? Having money is not sinful. Money is not sinful. I'll take it a step farther. Even the desire to have it can be sinful, but it is not necessarily sinful. I would say this: I'd rather have it than not have it. Right? But it can be taken to a sinful place where the pursuit of having it leads you to all manner of sin. Right? But money in and of itself is not a sinful thing. And so this inanimate, non-sinful object has caused all manner of sin to take place. It is the root of all evil, right? As Paul said. And so we can see there that there's a biblical principle that stands that just because something causes sin doesn't necessarily make that thing itself sinful. And so that's the same thing that's happening here with the law. Yes, the law has caused sin, but it is not itself sinful. In fact, as we mentioned a while ago, the law brings about the goodwill of God by showing us what sin is. And as we'll see here in just a second, not only showing us what sin is, but showing us how bad and wicked and evil sin is. And so Paul here uses an example. He said, I had not known lust. And that word lust there, again, I think I say this every time the word used, but the word lust just simply means desire. It is by definition a covetousness, because to covet something is to desire something. And that's why it says lust and then covet. He's talking about covetousness here. And so he says, I didn't know covetousness essentially until I saw the law, thou shalt not covet. And so it is likely that Paul here does not just mean that the law made him aware it was wrong. It does mean that. But I don't think it just means that, because he has already stated that the Gentiles, back in chapter 2, The Gentiles who don't have the law by nature do things that are in the law. In other words, we talked about this back in chapter 2. There's this universal moral law of God that is kind of imprinted upon us, that you can go anywhere, talk to any group, any tribe of any language, and there will be certain overlays of things that we consider morally wrong that they would also consider to be morally wrong. Right? All people of all times have considered things such as murder to be morally unacceptable, right? And so where does that moral universal code come from? It comes from the God who gave it to us, right? And so there's a sense in which we already kind of understood to a degree that certain things are wrong and certain things are right. But now, I think Paul has taken this a step further to say that Paul has not only made him understand that it was sin, but made him understand the true nature of sin. And so, in other words, sin isn't just wrong. Sin is more than that. It is rebellion against a holy God, and it is something worthy of death. That's what the law taught Israel, right? If you were an ancient Israelite and you went down to the temple, what would you see? You would see animal after animal after animal getting its throat slit and copious amounts of blood being released over and over and over, being put on the altar, and you would see death after death after death after death. Why? Because of sin. That's what they would have seen. They would have seen, as a result of the law, not only what sin was, but they would have seen the true nature of it. They would have seen how serious it is. Wiersbe, he said, the law is a mirror that reveals the inner man and shows us how dirty we are. In other words, they would have been able to, by the law, see that God, we've used this term a lot, that God has a perfect, holy standard, and that law showed them you fall short. You don't match it. You don't meet it. In fact, you fall so short that there needs to be death after death after death to even get you into the realm of it. And so we understand that this is what the law does. And so Paul, he adds this, he says, but sin, taking occasion by the commandment, wrought in me all manner of concupiscence. That's how that word is pronounced, a difficult word, concupiscence. And so now that the law had entered, and had made Paul aware, not only that it was sinful, but how sinful his covetous desires were, it was powerless to keep him from having those desires. And this is where the law itself falls short. The law could tell you, don't covet. The law could tell you covetousness is wrong. The law could even tell you covetousness is so wrong that it requires death as a covering for it. Right? The law could do all of those things, but the law could not keep you from coveting. That's what the law could not do. The law could not keep you from doing the sin itself. And so, in fact, he says not only could it not keep you from it, he said it intensified the desires for it. And so this is, again, we hit on this last week a little bit, but this is where some people kind of debate this, but I think it's pretty clear what he's saying, is that the law, he said, it intensified and they caused all manner of concupiscence. And so the word concupiscence, let me just kind of define that. The word itself generally means desire. Today, if you were to look up the definition of concupiscence today, it always means today sexual desire. If somebody's talking about concupiscence, they're talking about some kind of sexual sin or some kind of sexual desire today. However, scripturally, it can mean that. It can mean that, and sometimes it does. I think 1 Corinthians, maybe 1 Thessalonians, there are other places where it definitely does mean that. But it doesn't necessarily have to mean that. In other words, I don't think that Paul meant by this strictly sexual desires. It could have included them, but it's definitely not limited to them. And so when he said it wrought in me all manner of concupiscence, he's just talking about any sinful desire. But he says it was kind of exacerbated by the law. It was intensified by the law. And I'll give another kind of example of this. How many times have you either done this or seen somebody do this? Somebody has a little child, maybe a little 2-year-old or whatever. They sat them at the table and they're trying to get that kid to eat something. And the kid just isn't doing it. They're throwing it all over the place, throwing it on the floor, flipping their plate over, doing anything and everything but eating it. And then the parent comes along and says, don't you dare eat that broccoli. Don't you dare eat that little piece of corn, whatever it is. Don't you dare do. And then what does the child do? Picks up and eats it. Right? Because why? There is built within. Now, I'm not saying we should do that, but I'm saying people do this, okay? But built within us is this innate rebelliousness. It comes from Adam. It comes from the fall. It comes from our sinful nature. It's innate rebelliousness because there was a law. Now, they could have been saying it in a manner in which they knew it was going to be disobeyed. But the parents, by nature of the fact that they were the authority over that child, they gave a law. Don't. And what did the child do? Immediately took it and ate it. They broke the law. Just because of the fact that now there was a law. Right? They didn't want to eat it before, but now that the law has come into play, now I want to eat it. Now I want to. Why? Because there's rebelliousness. And so even though the law has shown us how terrible our sin is, again, worthy of death, worthy of all the things that happen at the temple, that's how terrible our sin is, but we have this innate desire to rebel against it, thus in a life unchanged by the gospel, because again, we're talking about prior to the gospel. In a life unchanged by the gospel, more law brings more rebellion. More law brings more rebellion. Now, does that make the law bad? No. If somebody goes out and kills somebody just because the law says don't, that doesn't mean we ought to get away with the law that says don't murder. No, the law was good. The law was supposed to be there. It's needed. But that at times does create within us this desire to rebel against it. And so he says, for without the law, sin was dead. For without the law, sin was dead. Now, this is where people, I think, sometimes get a little bit confused. Paul is not making absolutes here. He is not saying that every person prior to the knowledge of the law lived a sinless life. That's not the statement that Paul is making. Sin exists outside of the law. This is so easily explainable and easily provable. I almost just want to pass it over. But just to give kind of a very obvious example of this, it was wrong for Cain to murder Abel, even though the law that said don't murder didn't exist yet. It was still wrong. It was still sin. And Cain paid the punishment for that. And so we understand that sin still exists without the law, but without the knowledge of it, without the knowledge of what it is, without the awareness of it, without the knowledge of how serious it is, knowledge that spurs these sinful actions. Without all of this, that sin is not what it would be under the law. In other words, yes, it was still wrong for Cain to murder Abel. But had there been a law in place that says don't murder and he still did it, now it's even worse. Right? Now you have committed an even worse affront against God. And so without the law, sin was dead. And so he kind of explains this a little bit further. Paul says, for I was alive without the law once. And again, Paul is talking about himself, I believe, prior to his conversion. Prior to his conversion, Paul says, I was alive without the law once. But when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. And again, we have to not take Paul farther than what he's intending us to take it. Not absolutes. He's not saying I was alive spiritually. In other words, I would have gone to heaven until I was made aware of the law. And then that knowledge of the law is what made me die spiritually. Right? And so this is not what he's saying. He's not speaking in absolutes here. But this explains the life, again, of those prior to the knowledge of God's law in the sense that he's been describing. The knowledge of the seriousness of sin and the nature of our own rebellion. And so prior to this knowledge, Paul says he was alive. Now, what does he mean by this? And this is what I meant earlier. This is relatable to us. Paul means that he was able to go on with his life of sinful passions and desires with nothing hindering him. In other words, he was able to continue on in a lifestyle of sin without any hindrance of conviction, without any hindrance of regret, because he wasn't made aware of those things yet. But the second that the knowledge of the law came into play, that doesn't mean that he's going to stop doing those things, but now I'm sinning with the knowledge of what I'm doing. Right? And so I'll use this word. There is bliss in sinful ignorance. There is a bliss that exists prior to somebody coming to you with the gospel. There is a bliss that exists prior to someone coming to you, opening the book and showing you exactly what you're doing is wrong. Does that mean that you were okay, spiritually speaking, that everything was fine until somebody showed you the gospel? No, you were spiritually dead, but you were ignorant of it. You were ignorant of everything. And so now you go out, once that knowledge has been given to you, you go out and you sin. Well, now you know, so-and-so told me I shouldn't be doing this. And he told me that this is an affront to God. And they showed me how sinful this is, how serious this is. They told me that, this sin was one of the reasons why Jesus himself went to the cross and died. now you're sinning not in ignorance anymore. Now you're willfully sinning. Now you're willfully sinning with the knowledge of what it is and what it cost Christ to cover. There's a difference. And so Paul says, I was alive once, right? I was living in blissful ignorance until the law came. And then when the law came, he says, sin revived and I died. Now there was conviction, right? Now there was things that existed within me that didn't exist prior. Now he knows what sin is. Now he knows that when the law produces sin in his life because of his own rebelliousness, now there's a conviction that didn't exist before. Again, the time of sinful ignorance has ended. And Paul mentions this. Paul mentions sinning in ignorance prior to his conversion. He mentions this in other places and in his other letters. And so there is a sense in which there is to a degree, there is a bliss that exists in the ignorance that we lived in prior to the gospel. And so this is where I'll make it more personal to you. Think back to the time that you first became aware of the truth of your own sin. Right? Now, it kind of depends on what age you were. But if you were saved as an adult, particularly as an adult who had lived a worldly lifestyle, we might say, for some time. Think back to the time where you first became aware that the life that you were living is a life that could potentially lead you right to hell. Think about how that affected you. Now, if there was a time that existed between the gospel first coming to you and your salvation, you can be intimately aware of how different of a life you're going to live now. Not to say that your attitude changed, not to say that you don't go out and sin anymore, but now there's this itch at the back of your mind because you're doing things in full knowledge of what you're doing, in full knowledge of what it cost Christ to cover. And so you can no longer live the sinful life in the same way. Not to say that you won't, but it's to say that you can't do it in the same way. Again, not to say that you don't sin. It's that now you're sinning with the knowledge of what you're doing, right? So there's a difference here. Now you have died in the sense that you know you're not good enough like maybe you used to think you were. Right? And this is one thing, Ray Comfort, that's the guy's name, Ray Comfort. He does these street interviews, you could say, where he'll go and he'll talk to people, and he'll just kind of run through the 10 Commandments. He'll ask them, do you think you're a good person? Do you think you're going to heaven? And more than often, they'll say yes. I'm not saying I'm the greatest person to ever live, but yeah, I think, generally I've lived a good enough life. And so he'll just say, well, let's just, have you ever stolen something? Have you ever, to the men, have you ever looked at a woman with lust? Have you ever lied? He'll just go through this 10 Commandments. And if they're honest, what they'll say is, well, yeah, I've done that. Yeah, okay, I've maybe when I was at work, maybe I stole something that I shouldn't take in. Maybe I've looked at a woman with lust. And so, Ray will say, well, you said you're a good person, but by your own admission, these aren't my words, these are your words. You're a lying adulterer at heart. This is who you are. Right? And so their eyes are open to the truth of who they were. Prior, 10 minutes ago, that person was sinning in ignorance and in bliss because they thought, yeah, I may not be the best person that's alive, but you know what? I'm probably good enough. Right? When I stand before God and my good's going to outweigh my bad and I'm going to get an entrance into heaven that, I think I've earned is essentially what they're saying. And then the gospel comes in, the knowledge of God's law comes into play, and all of a sudden they're come face to face with who they actually are. Face to face with the life that they're actually living, and all of a sudden they can see, well, maybe I'm not as good as I thought I was. And so this is, this is what the gospel does. This is what the knowledge of the law does to a person. And so this is at the point where, again, where Paul's saying here, sin revived and I died. Not died in the sense that he's talking about in chapter 6 where we died with Christ. That's not what he's talking about. But died to the sense where I can't live the same life that I used to live. Not in that sinful ignorance. Not in that bliss that I used to have. John Phillips, he said, before the law came, there was a freedom from an accusing conscience. A kind of false peace brought about by man's ignorance of his alienation from God. The coming of the law changed all this. I like what he says here. Its straight edge reveals the crookedness of human nature and even goes a step further and forces into the open all the latent rebellion of the human heart. And that's why the gospel, it changes a person because the gospel cannot leave you as you were. It can't. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to save you. Not necessarily so. But the gospel takes a dead person and shows them they're dead. And when you have the knowledge of the fact that you're dead and you're not as good as you were, your life is going to change one way or another. Either you're going to continue on in a life of rebellion that was even worse than it was before, or the gospel is going to come in and make you new. Right? And so this is why the gospel matters so much. This is why the knowledge of the law matters so much. This is why, I've said this in the past, but this is why when you're dealing with a person one-on-one, you're witnessing to them, whether it's somebody you know or somebody you just met, whatever the case may be, the worst thing we can do for that person is coddle their sin. The worst thing we can do for that person is to have a conversation with them and make them think, you really aren't that bad. Right? Your sins, yeah, you maybe shouldn't do them, but it's not that bad. It's not that big of a deal. No, it is a big deal. And they need to know it's a big deal. Because if they walk away from that conversation thinking, well, why do I need the church? Why do I need somebody to come and die for me if my sins aren't that big of a deal? No, they need to know that their sins were such a big deal that Jesus himself had to go to the cross to pay for them. Right? That's what they need to know. And so that's what Paul's kind of indicating for us now. That's what the knowledge of the law does. That's what the knowledge of how serious sin is does. Now, that's not enough to save you, because salvation is by grace through faith. Salvation is not by the knowledge of how sinful you were. Now, that's a step towards it, but salvation is by grace through faith. And so he says, and the commandment which was ordained to life, I found to be unto death. And so this is kind of the flip side of what he's already been saying. And so we've already seen that the law was given for good purposes. When followed to its intended end, the law brought significant blessings to the people who followed it. We read in Leviticus chapter 18, it says, you shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments. And then he says this, which if a man do, he shall live in them. He will live in them, meaning I will grant life and blessing and abundance to you beyond what you can even really comprehend. You go read through the Pentateuch in particular, but you go read through the first 5 books and you see over and over and over the blessings that God promised to those who followed the law. Now, they never did that, but God promised these blessings to the people who did. However, what the law also does, it exposes your heart. It shows you who you are. And as such, Paul found it to be unto death. As it produced sin in his life, he saw that he stood condemned. Again, now he has a knowledge of it. Now he knows it's wrong. Now he knows how wrong it is. And so that which should have been a blessing to him, the law, turned to death because of his own sinful rebellion. And so now every time he committed a sin, Paul was aware of the knowledge of how bad that was. And the law was standing as this model of God's perfect holiness. And every time Paul sinned, he could see, well, I'm falling short. In fact, I'm getting further away from it because I keep adding on sin on top of sin on top of sin. And so this thing that should have been a blessing to him, he said, I found it to be unto death. For sin, he says, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and by it slew me. And so here he personifies sin. And he shows that using the law as a means to deceive and actually to kill. To deceive and to kill. And this is exactly what sin does. Sin promises you joy and pleasure, and then it leads you down a road to death. That's what sin does. Sin, it never reveals itself for what it truly is. Sin never comes out and says, hey, come have a good time for a short while, and then we're going to go ahead and lead you right on to your death. But that's exactly what sin is. That's exactly what sin does. And make no mistake about it, unlike God, who gives you what you don't deserve, sin will give you what you do. And I want you to really get this. God gives you what you don't deserve. Sin gives you what you do deserve. Because we just read at the end of chapter 6 that the wages of sin is death. Sin will give you what you've earned. God will give you what you can't earn. Right? God grants you grace, which by its nature you cannot earn. Sin will give you what you've spent a lifetime earning. And what you have spent a lifetime earning is your death. And so as sin waged war against Paul, the law stood there strong as a judge and a jury proclaiming him guilty. Every time he sinned, Paul thought, I've broken the law. And that law has shown me that I'm really not good enough. I'm not good enough. All the lambs, all the bulls, all the animals that were killed over and over at the temple, all those showed the people, you're not good enough. That's what the knowledge of the law does. And then Paul gives his kind of ultimate answer to the question that he asked in verse 7. In verse 12, he says, wherefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy, just, and good. And so when he says the commandment, he's used that word a couple times here. He's used the terms law, and he's used the term commandment. The law would be kind of just generally the whole thing, and the commandment would be specific individual rules, laws within what we would call the law. But he says the law is holy, and even the individual commandments that make up the law, they're holy, they're just, they're good. And so no, Paul was not claiming anything wrong with the law. Paul was not claiming that there was anything sinful with the law. No, he says very contrary to that. It is holy, it is just, it is good. And so contrary to the claims against him, Paul was not claiming anything negative about it. Everything, and here's the ironic part of this, everything negative that people were attributing to Paul and saying, here's what Paul is saying about the law. Everything negative that people were attributing to Paul, he was really teaching about their own sinfulness. And so when people say, well, Paul's claiming that the law is sinful. No, he's saying that you're sinful. Paul is claiming that the law is wicked. No, you're wicked. The law just exposes it. Right? And so everything that they said Paul was claiming about the law, Paul was teaching it, but not about the law. He was teaching it about them, the individuals, the person in our sinful, natural rebelliousness. And so at the end of the day, we understand the law only caused sin in that it revealed a brokenness that exists within inside of us. If someone is justly condemned by the law, it's not the law's fault they sinned. Right? And so again, if you stand condemned before a judge today, you commit some grievous crime, you go to court, you're found guilty, you can't stand up and say, well, it was the law's fault. The law's fault. If the law didn't exist, I wouldn't stand here today. Well, no, the law just exposed the fact that you broke it. The law's not wrong. You were wrong. Right? And so now I'm not saying that all laws are good and we should have every law we have. That's all I'm saying. But what I am saying is that we can't blame the law when we break the law. We are exposed for our own sinfulness. And so Paul says, no, the law is holy. To quote Bruce here, he says, the law is holy because God, whose character it reflects and whose will it declares, is himself holy. This is what we were talking about earlier. The law was an expression of God's own goodness and love and benevolent will for the people of Israel. Right? And so Paul can call the law holy because the God who gave it is holy. Right? And so the law is holy. He said it's just. And more often than not, when the Bible uses that, it kind of, I think the best way we could explain this would be that it's fair. It is just in that it is fair. 7 times the Bible talks about the fact that God is no respecter of persons, meaning he doesn't show partiality. If you've broken the law, it doesn't matter who you are, what your status is, how rich you are, the things you've done prior. If you broke the law, you broke the law. God is just. The law itself is just. He saw the law as good. And again, we've already said it several times. Its purpose was to bring about life and blessing. It was good. It was good in that sense. And so kind of to work to a conclusion, verse 13 here kind of stands as a transition. Some people take it with the section we just talked about. Some people take it with the next section. I'll probably make reference to it in both, to be honest. But verse 13, he says, was then that which is good made death unto me? God forbid. But sin, that it might appear sin, worketh death in me by that which is good, that sin by the commandment might become exceeding sinful. And so verse 13, again, it's kind of a bridge. It stands as a bridge between both sections here. And so it kind of sums up what Paul has already said. And so what brought about our death was not the law. What brought about our death was our sinful nature. Mm-hmm. What brought about our death was the fact that, not that we broke the law, what brought about our death is that we sinned, that we rebelled against a holy God, and the law stood there just as a means to show us you sinned and you broke the law and you rebelled against a holy God. That's what the law does. The law exposes it. And so the law showed us what God's holy standard was, and it revealed how far we fell short of that standard. Right? I mean, people talk about this all the time, that there were over 600 laws. You go through the Old Testament, most people come up with a number that's a little over 600. And not one person, save one, ever lived a life even close to fulfilling all 600 plus of those laws. And that's why Jesus said it. He said on the Sermon on the Mount, he didn't come to abolish it, he came to what? He came to fulfill it. Right? He said, I didn't just come to do away with it. I come to actually do what the law said to do what you could not do. To follow every single one of those laws, because those laws show and reveal God's perfect holy standard. I'm going to live that life. I'm going to do what you were incapable of doing so that I can then take your sins upon me. I'm not dying for my sins. I'm dying for yours. And that's what Jesus came to do. And so the law showed us that holy standard, and Christ was the only one who could match it. And so again, there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with the law. In fact, God's perfect holiness shines even brighter because of the law. It shows us so clearly how far we are from that perfect holiness. It shows us how good and how beautiful and how holy our God is, because it sets this standard that we are just incapable of reaching. Amen. And so it shows us not only how holy our God is, but the gulf that exists between us and Him. And it is a mighty gulf. And so here's what we must understand. The law has its role, and it's an important one. But, and this is the biggest thing, the law could never do what Christ did. The law could not do what Christ did. As we said earlier, the law can show you, here's God's standard. And the law can show you that you broke God's standard. And the law can even show you, here's how serious it is that you broke it. Because here's what's required to cover it. But as we said earlier, the law couldn't keep you from it. And ultimately, the law was incapable of providing any lasting fulfillment of it. Because what happened? You read the book of Hebrews, and what does it say? Year after year after year after year, the high priest had to bring in the bull, and he had to bring in the goat, and he had to make the sacrifices for himself and for the nation. But was it a lasting sacrifice? No, because the next year, you know what they're going to do? The same thing. And they're going to do it the year after that, and the year after that, and it was ongoing. It was never a complete fulfillment of the law. And that's why Jesus came and gave a once-for-all sacrifice that fulfilled its demands. And so Christ did for us what the law could not do. It actually and finally and perfectly covers us. Phillips, again, he said, the high and holy standard of behavior demanded by the law leaves the sinner exposed, lost, and defenseless. The law cannot save. That is the prerogative of grace. Paul found as a sinner that his best efforts to win salvation were unavailing. He was confronted with the law which was holy and just and good, the lofty pinnacles of which he could never climb. And so again, that's what the law was, holy, just, and good. You know what we are not? Holy, just, and good. And so the law showed us, here's God, here's His standard, and by breaking it over and over and over, by requiring the death of all these animals, here where you are, you stand condemned. You stand condemned. You're guilty. And so for the Christian, sin is unthinkable for a lot of reasons. We've been talking about this for several weeks now. Not the least of which is that it put our Savior on the cross. And this is something we need to think about. Every time we face temptation, and there's a lot of things that we could run through, scriptures we could turn to, but ultimately what we need to remember is that Christ paid the ultimate penalty for me to not do that. Christ paid the ultimate penalty to cover the ones that I've already committed. Why would I take it upon myself to willingly add more punishment, more shame, more unworthiness to what Jesus already suffered, already endured? However, now through the law, we know what it is. We know what sin is. We know how serious it is. And to continue to do so, as we just read there in verse 13, makes it exceeding sinful. Makes it exceeding sinful. It was already sin. But it now to sin in light of our knowledge of it makes it exceeding sinful. So because it is exceeding sinful, I will add this. We must be exceeding careful to keep ourselves from this deadly endeavor. And I'll close with this scripture from 1 Peter chapter 4. It says, for as much then as Christ hath suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves likewise with the same mind. For he that hath suffered in the flesh hath ceased from sin, that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh to the lust of men, but to the will of God. Let's pray this morning. Lord, as always, we thank you for Scripture.